In the silence that followed the Sorcerer King's statement, His Majesty casually rose from his seat. Ludmilla hadn't noticed his entry. None of the Elder Liches had shown any reaction to his presence, either. He must have silently flown in from another entrance out of her field of view. Elder Liches could see through invisibility, so he also must have entered with the aid of a more advanced concealment spell. With a purposeful, yet unhurried stride, His Majesty made his way to the grand dais. The magnificence of the Sorcerer King dominated the stage, and the 4 Elder Liches in the air landed to kneel before him. Lady Shiltir remained in the air above, carefully scanning the auditorium. "Are you all right, Lady Zaradnik?" the Sorcerer King asked. Ludmilla's cheeks grew heated at his concern, and she lowered her head. "I am unharmed, Your Majesty," she answered solemnly. "Thank you for your assistance. How did you find us?" "Pure chance," His Majesty said. "Well, perhaps not. The major thoroughfares of Lagos all lead to this dome, and its distinct appearance begged investigation. Shiltir and I entered from the observation deck encircling the building. The wraiths I sent to scout the interior spotted the Elder Liches inside, and we arrived just in time to secure front-row seats to the show." "I see. It seems that you were committed to fighting these Elder Liches. Did you believe you stood any chance?" "I only sought ways by which I might prevail," Ludmilla replied, "but the ultimate outcome was obscured in too many unknowns." The Sorcerer King chuckled at her response. "So even when confronted with what would drive even an adamantite rank adventurer to despair, you, a platinum rank, instead sought a path to victory." "Simply giving up and dying was not an option," Ludmilla said. "Even if death lay at the end of my struggle, I'd still be able to inflict some harm and learn about my opponents. After that opening attack, however, I was fairly certain that I could at least escape." His Majesty nodded. "You darted off quite quickly there. Those who employ flight magic are often overly reliant on it as their sole motive force. It's been a long time since I've seen someone use it to carry their momentum like that. You've figured out an annoying trick against adversaries that rely on ranged attacks. It's also convenient for getting around when one doesn't have access to teleportation. I have these Elder Liches to thank for that." I noticed that they physically launched themselves into the air instead of slowly accelerating with their flight magic. Out of the Elder Liches present, only Captain Iska reacted to their discussion. The others only continued to kneel with their heads bowed. "What happened to them?" Ludmilla asked. "Just the usual undead domination skill." His Majesty shrugged as if there was no difference between a skeleton warrior and a set of powerful Elder Liches. "After seeing the head of their cabal blown up, I believe that the value of basic courtesy has risen in their estimation." Ludmilla looked over at where the remains of the eldest had fallen. No trace of the undead mage remained, not even its tattered brown robe. To the side, Captain Iska had been charred black by the eldest's fireball, but his borrowed garments remained as clean and undamaged as when he was first dressed in them. The Elder Lich wrung his hands, trepidation filling his voice as he spoke. What is to become of us, Your Majesty?" he asked. "The head of our cabal acted in such an insulting manner." "The ignorance born of isolation certainly showed," the Sorcerer King said, "and the price for that ignorance has been paid in full. Did the head of your cabal truly believe that 9th-tier magic was the pinnacle of power?" "Our members were still developing 4th and 5th-tier magic," the captain said. "The eldest was on the verge of grasping 6th-tier spells and evolving into a Night Lich. Only a handful of beings possess 8th-tier magic, to our knowledge. Such as this Kfandru Argyros, Shiltir, heal the good captain." Greater lethal. A colossal torrent of negative energy washed over Captain Iska, and his blackened bones returned to their undamaged condition. The Elder Lich marveled at the effects of the spell. "Thank you, Lady Shiltir." Captain Iska bobbed his head 3 times before addressing His Majesty once again. "Kfandra Argyros is the owner of the undead merchant company that comes by every few years. I've heard that it was founded to secure the flow of research materials required for his forays into 9th-tier magic." "I see. So this is what inspired you to make your own attempts at trade?" "Yes, Your Majesty," the captain nodded again, "but I don't seem to be any good at it." "If that is the case, why have you not entered under this Night Lich's employ to earn an income while gaining experience? His representatives are all under his domination." The Elder Lich's gaze shifted to his 4 dominated colleagues momentarily. "I would rather remain independent. I thought about joining Corpus of the Abyss, the undead association that Gvandragaros became a member of in recent centuries, at one point, but I still would have probably been seen by Gvandragaros as unwelcome competition and quietly disposed of. The Sorcerer King turned to look at Ludmilla. She shook her head slightly. The first I've heard of this organization was from Captain Iska, she said. They're a group that has grown in prominence recently, according to him. They've been around for centuries, Your Majesty, the captain offered, but they were apparently nothing more than a rumor amongst the living until about 100 years ago. Something made them change their clandestine ways and now they're reaching out to intelligent undead all around the world. Have you any idea of this organization's size? The Sorcerer King asked. When they made themselves known to us, Captain Iska replied, it was just under 100 years ago. They had around 120 members in their outer circle back then. The last I heard, that number's grown to around 300 in the last few years. There's an unspecified number of powerful individuals in their inner circle, made up of long-standing members from before their shift in policy. Elder Liches were not extraordinarily rare, but unless one lived in the Sorceress Kingdom, a regular individual probably wouldn't see one in their lifetime. Not that one of the living would wish to encounter a wild Elder Lich, as death would probably follow shortly after. The number in Corpus of the Abyss indicated that the organization probably spanned a good portion of the world. What is the purpose of Corpus of the Abyss? The Sorcerer King continued with his questions. So many intelligent undead would surely draw attention from their neighbors. Originally, they were sort of a grand cabal? Captain Iska replied, a loose association of undead casters who decided it was better to work for mutual benefit and avoid conflicts over knowledge. And the collective will of the cabal ensures the compliance of its members. The Sorcerer King stroked his chin. Yes, Your Majesty, the captain nodded. According to the merchants, it's still much the same, but non-casters have become members recently. Death Knights, vampires, banshees, mummies, all sorts of cognizant undead are joining, really. Ludmilla wondered what had happened to spur the growth of Corpus of the Abyss. They now seemed substantial enough that nations of multiple races would likely set aside their differences to wage a war of annihilation against what they considered to be the enemies of life. Does Corpus of the Abyss have a base of operations? His Majesty asked. That part hasn't changed much from the old days, Captain Iska replied. Members usually stay where they've been for hundreds of years, minding their own business, much like us. I don't know if they count as bases or not, but there are a number of city-states and small nations ruled by powerful undead. They even interact with the living. One of these days, I'd like to go and visit those places, but they're all far away from here. What he described existed as details in tales that Ludmilla had heard recited in the past. They all seemed mere works of fiction at the time, but apparently, they were based in truth. That these tales all had some connection to one another was not something anyone considered. Not a bad idea, His Majesty said. Once the Sorceress Kingdom firmly establishes itself in the immediate region, seeing what lies further abroad is the logical next step. Perhaps the world will not be as hostile to our existence as I had initially thought. Just one look is all it will take, Your Majesty, Captain Iska said. I don't think any undead being can deny your supreme existence. The Sorcerer King looked down at the four elder liches still genuflecting before him. After a moment, they jerked slightly before going down to their knees, pressing their foreheads to the stone. Forgive us, O Supreme Overlord of Death, one intoned. We have displayed great disrespect to your herald, and thus your most esteemed personage. How might we atone for this grave sin? What was that about inane prattling again? Captain Iska muttered. His Majesty remained silent in the wake of their plea, and four pairs of shoulders draped in tattered cloth trembled. The Sorcerer King floated over to land on one of the daises, perusing the stone tablets neatly organized upon it. Count yourselves fortunate that the Baroness has a measure of temperance, he told them. Many of my vassals would have instantly destroyed the lot of you for your conduct. Well, considering the interesting things Lady Zaradnik always seems to come up with, immediate destruction might actually be a mercy. Now, what shall I do with you, Captain Iska? Yes, Your Majesty? I am designating you as the official leader of this cabal. I believe you were next in line, anyway. Any new elder liches that manifest in the region will be sent to work under you. Thank you, Your Majesty, the elder lich said. What about my trading company? My subjects have a great appetite for magics that will improve industry and their everyday lives, the Sorcerer King told him. Your cabal is effectively a research institute that can come up with new spells and magic items for those purposes. My nation will benefit from your work, and you will advance your magical knowledge. The profits from your industry can go towards personal projects. This is a mutually beneficial arrangement, is it not? Captain Iska lowered his head, his tall skeletal frame bending nearly perpendicular at the waist. Your wisdom and generosity know no bounds, Your Majesty, he said. May the Sorceress Kingdom forever prosper under your guidance. The Sorcerer King nodded. His Majesty continued looking through the Katsa Cabal's research. Ludmilla frowned at the quivering forms of the Elder Liches. Was it really all right to leave it at that? She understood the broad effect that the Sorcerer King had on the undead, but they had still gone from attempting to incinerate someone to their current state. Ludmilla's gaze ran over the Elder Liches as she activated a skill. Her eyes narrowed when they fell upon the third undead mage. She slowly walked up to it, the heels of her boots tapping over the stone. What have you done? She asked. The Elder Lich stirred slightly, but said nothing. Is something the matter, Lady Zaradnik? His Majesty asked. This one has acted against your will, she answered. As the words left Ludmilla's mouth, Lady Shiltir flew down to hover protectively over her liege. The Sorcerer King looked over from his platform. Against my will. Your existence was unconfirmed at that juncture, the Elder Lich spoke in his own defense. Had I known of your magnificence, I would not have acted as I did. And precisely what is it that you've done? While we were examining Lady Zaradnik, it said, I contacted an acquaintance in Corpus of the Abyss via message, relaying information until your Majesty dominated me. Did they say anything? No. The Elder Lich shook its head, they only listened. There have been no attempts to re-establish contact on their end. Shall I attempt to do so? His Majesty appeared to ponder the question for several moments. How do you believe they will react to your information? Caution. Many of the more wary members will most likely go into hiding until they believe they have discerned your Majesty's motives. Any attempts at investigation that they make will most likely be limited to unobtrusive, long-range divination. Considering our location, mindless undead infiltrators used in conjunction with certain spells may also be used with minimal risk. Ludmilla's lips drew into a thin line. Message spells were one of the major magic-related problems that they had no answer for. As it was a harmless spell, its use was not illegal and it could not be prevented by defensive magics. Even the powerful magical barriers protecting Erantal's central district could not stop a message spell from reaching its recipient. Since it was a second-tier spell, not only was it used for everyday communication by magic casters, but the spell could be scribed on scrolls. Those scrolls could, in turn, be used by rogues and bards who acted as spies and infiltrators. When she looked into potential countermeasures, the researchers in her territory speculated that it would require some unknown form of abjuration to block. If such a spell already existed, it was almost certainly a well-kept national secret to those who possessed it. I suppose we'll have to see where this leads us, the Sorcerer King said. I don't particularly relish the idea that information about us is spreading faster than it should, but the existence of the Sorceress Kingdom is hardly a secret. Our defenses should prevent divination against anything trying to poke their noses where they shouldn't, but infiltrators should also be expected. Well, we do allow spies in the Sorceress Kingdom, but having wraiths flying around looking at things might be disruptive for our citizens. His Majesty set down the stone tablet in his hand and returned to the main level of the stage. Now that things are tentatively settled, he said, we should continue with our investigation. Captain Iska, I assume you've already explored this city thoroughly. Were there any locations with vaults or similarly inaccessible areas? A few, Your Majesty, he replied. Shall I guide you to them? That would save us a lot of meandering, the Sorcerer King said. Lead the way, Captain. Your Majesty, what you said back there, you made it sound as if I could have beaten 5 Elder Liches. As Captain Iska led them back outdoors, Ludmilla fell into her usual habit of reviewing recent events and exchanges. Several things bothered her, one of which was the idea that she had been propped up to a ridiculous degree by His Majesty. Yes, that's right. But they were all stronger than I was, a few of them very much so. You even said that it was a situation that would make even an adamantite rank adventurer despair. At first glance, His Majesty said, it certainly would. All things being equal, 1 Elder Lich would have been a problem, never mind 5. Things were far from equal, however. Despite their long existence, you clearly had more practical combat experience. Not only was there a gap in experience, but one in equipment, as well. They turned a corner, and the Sorcerer King glanced into each of the side rooms as they passed by. When they decided to treat you as a threat, he went on, their only move was to create distance. There were no defensive magics employed, they were simply ganging up on you under the notion that raw force would be sufficient. If they pressed their apparent advantage and pursued you into a battleground of your choosing, your victory would be nearly assured. You were effectively fighting 5 naked Elder Liches, and pure arcane casters have roughly a third of the physical capabilities of an equivalent warrior. It would not have been much different than dispatching a skeleton warrior once you got in close, and arcane casters usually have poor detection ability. All you needed to do was sneak up and give them a good whack. Just to be sure, Your Majesty, Captain Iska piped up, I don't have to worry about defending myself in the Sorceress Kingdom, do I? Instances of violent crime are next to non-existent in both the city and the territories, the Sorcerer King told him. The Royal Army is currently in the process of securing the Katza Plains, as well. Once they reach Lagos, you'll be able to arrange for suitable security. That being said, you do have plans to travel abroad. It would be prudent to ensure you have a proper lineup of defensive spells and magic equipment. Ahead of them, a dim glow started to fill the corridor. They left the building, stepping out under the radiance of the High Emperor's staff. Did you check these statues before going in, Lady Zaradnik? Yes, Your Majesty. Lagos was not just the capital of the Katza Plains, it appears to have been the capital of an empire. This statue is that of High Emperor Archelaus III. The other 5 are members of royalty from various races, each a pentarch of the city. Going by the dates on their plaques, they were famous figures from this empire's early past. So it was an empire where humans, elves, demi-humans and heteromorphs lived together? They still had their respective habitats, but yes. Which leaves me very confused. Why is that? Because I've been making assumptions under the premise that this was a human nation, much like the human nations nearby. Humans did live here, but they weren't the only citizens of this empire, in this part of it, at least. When I surmised that the nation here was similar to the Sorceress Kingdom, I had no idea that even this detail would be similar. I suppose the idea might be strange to someone who has lived in relative isolation as a subject of Riastais, His Majesty said. But at the same time, there are nations in this region of the world where humans exist alongside other races. The Carnassus City-State Alliance is one such place, as is the Argland Confederation. I hear that the Holy Kingdom of Roble has friendly relations with aquatic demi-humans, as well. The Argland Confederation had rulers who were powerful in their own right, so it could be explained as the strong imposing their will on the weak. Aquatic demi-humans did not compete with humans for the same habitat, so there would be room for amicable relations in Roble. She had no idea what happened in Carnassus to make it so that humans were not simply eaten off of the streets. Captain Iska led them several hundred meters to the base of the hill where the dome stood. From there, he led them up some stairs to the columned entrance of another building. A partially defaced emblem was carved into the stone over the entrance. The Merchant Guild? It appears to match the emblem used by the branches in Riastais and the Empire, the Sorcerer King nodded. Ours as well, of course. Considering that we found trade currency earlier, the presence of the Merchant Guild shouldn't be a surprise. They made their way into the building, crossing behind a dust-covered stone counter and stopping at the door to a vault in the back. Ludmilla frowned at its rusted surface as His Majesty walked up to inspect it. Adventurers talk about the excitement that comes with discovering long-lost treasures, she said, but this just makes me feel like a thief. The Sorcerer King, who was rubbing his skeletal hands together, seemed to flinch at her words. Well, it doesn't appear to be enchanted. Has anyone tried to force this open, Captain Iska? Nothing we could summon or dominate could break in. The 2 Death Knights didn't want to risk their equipment and they couldn't punch through. None of our spells could do anything to it, either. Ludmilla eyed the rusted vault door again. This is just steel, isn't it? It may just be steel, His Majesty said, but what we discussed about hardness and durability still applies to it. With sufficient artifice, it becomes quite difficult to damage without the appropriate equipment or attacks. Shall I open it, Lord Ines? Umu. Be careful of any traps. They backed away as Lady Shiltir stepped forward. She reached out and turned the handle, which abruptly snapped off. Her liege frowned down at the broken piece of steel before tossing it aside and unequipping her gauntlets. With a small HMPH noise, she pierced the door with a jab of her fingers. After creating another handhold, she floated into the air and pulled. The building shuddered as the entire vault detached itself from the wall. Dust and stone fragments rained down from the ceiling as what appeared to be the whole back quarter of the Merchant Guild advanced towards them. Just how sturdy did they make this thing? His Majesty muttered. Cut it open, Shiltir. Lady Shiltir's fingernails sliced into the vault door, carving open a hole roughly 2 meters in diameter. She tossed the detached portion away to join the broken handle. A loud clang sounded when it struck the wall, and everyone winced. Apologies for making such an undignified racket, Lord Ines. I think we are well past the point of undignified. Turn undead. Captain Iska ran screaming out of the building, and Lady Shiltir gestured towards the makeshift entrance with a smile. After His Majesty entered the vault, she produced a file and started tending to her nails. How long is Captain Iska going to be running away for? Ludmilla asked. Who knows? Lady Shiltir answered lightly. Inside, they found His Majesty stepping over the fallen drawers and boxes within. A banging noise sounded from the rear of the vault, and Ludmilla stepped ahead to see what it was. At the end of the furthest row of rusted shelves, several dozen assorted undead were trying to force their way through the steel wall. What are they doing? Trying to run away from Shiltir, His Majesty told her, but she's in the way of the entrance. Turn undead was used to make Captain Iska run away, but it's an area effect skill. Does that mean every undead in the area will come back to attack her once the effect expires? Maybe. After Ludmilla and Lady Shiltir destroyed the thousands of undead that swarmed into the Merchant Guild, they returned to the vault. They found His Majesty with a number of heavily decayed containers strewn over the floor around him. This mist is quite annoying, he said. I thought that this vault might have stayed nice and dry, but moisture managed to seep in and all of the documents have rotted away. Did anything else survive? There is a row of metal safes in the back, His Majesty replied, but they were all opened and emptied. Since it appears that attempts to evacuate were made, I assumed that anything of value easily transported was taken as well. I suppose we should target any magically sealed vaults rather than mundane ones. Speaking of which, where is the captain? He hasn't returned yet, Your Majesty. They went back outside to wait below the entrance of the Merchant Guild. After Lady Shiltir stopped apologizing profusely for inconveniencing the Sorcerer King, he came over to speak to Ludmilla. While the captain is still away, he said, there is something I would like to ask you about, Lady Zaradnik. Of course, Ludmilla replied. I am at your service. Back with the rest of those elder liches, he said, you identified one that had acted against my will. Is that the Justic Herm, the skill that you regained use of recently? Yes, Your Majesty. He regarded her silently, and Ludmilla tried her best not to think about how close he was. Have you explored the applications of this skill and the class that provides it? The Sorcerer King asked. What is it that leads you to believe that it allows you to identify individuals that act against my will? Could it not be, say, something that identifies those who go against codified law, legislation and policy? I've studied what I could recognize from the class in depth, Ludmilla replied. It does not specifically identify criminals. There have been cases of individuals performing criminal acts that are not identified as such with my skill. One such case involved an exercise in Volkenheim County. I did not know it was an exercise until the culprit was apprehended, and I was unable to recognize that he was the culprit through this skill despite the fact that he performed multiple criminal acts. And this has happened with genuine criminals? What do you see, exactly? It has, Ludmilla nodded. As for what I sense, it's hard to describe. Perhaps the best way to put it would be how aligned they are with your will, conveyed in various sensations and feelings. All of the cases with genuine criminals that do not register strongly with the skill are those to whom a fair and just ruler may hand out purely corrective sentences. For instance, a loyal subject that does not know they are committing a crime, and would not have done so had they known. In this case, ensuring that appropriate compensation is made is sufficient. I admit that is what I would do, but still, that skill sounds very precise. What did that elder lich look like to you? That he did something wrong, something you wouldn't have wanted him to. That reading is also true. Interesting. I wonder how it works. Rangers can detect and track their quarry, while pets can sense the intent of their controller, something that incorporates both. But you're not my pet. The Sorcerer King continued muttering to himself in thought, using words and terms that Ludmilla had no idea about. Out of curiosity, His Majesty looked over at her again. How does Shaltir register to this skill? Wah. Lord Ines. Lady Shaltir started to tremble, her crimson gaze going back and forth between the Sorcerer King and Ludmilla. My lady is out of alignment, Ludmilla said. Ho. His Majesty turned to regard Lady Shaltir. Her liege's face went through a series of complicated expressions, and her legs collapsed under her. No, Lord Ines, she whimpered. That being said, Ludmilla continued, no free-minded individual can be in perfect alignment with another. I imagine that if I could use the skill on myself, the reading would probably be more pronounced than that of my lady. Indeed, the Sorcerer King said. That Shaltir registers as such to this skill gladdens my heart. It does? Lady Shaltir looked up at His Majesty in confusion. He seemed to smile, extending a hand to help her to her feet. He nodded. I do not desire for you to be someone who arbitrarily acts to fulfill my wishes, and I certainly don't want anyone imitating me to the degree that our wills are identical. That would actually be rather disturbing. The Baroness' skill provides her with a single metric that is merely one out of many that must be analyzed to derive a reasonable assessment. It is not as simple as innocent or guilty at a glance, am I correct? It is as your Majesty says, Ludmilla nodded. Acting with due diligence is always the best course, where possible. The Sorcerer King appeared satisfied at her response. He scanned the empty streets, but Captain Iska was still nowhere to be seen. His Majesty turned back to her, arms crossed, and presented a new, though not unrelated topic. Albedo seeks to create a commissariat under the executive arm of our government, he said. One that will provide oversight for all branches of the Sorceress Kingdom's government. I have presented this proposal to several others, including members of the royal court. The reception has been mixed. What are your thoughts on the effect that this organization might have on our nation? It would depend on the amount of oversight they were allowed, Ludmilla replied. Financial and judicial auditing, as well as ensuring that none of the nation's policies are being violated, I can see as being a welcome thing, but if these commissaries have enough power, their oversight may interfere with the nation's operations. It may sound strange, given my recent history, but I feel that agents with a certain degree of oversight can be a danger to your Majesty's order. Even if they possess the skills and abilities conferred to you by this class? Skills and abilities are tools, she said, much like any other. Barring curses or other magical strangeness, it is generally the user that is the problem. Power has a way of revealing the true character of an individual. This is a major reason why authority figures are looked upon with wariness, mistrust, or just outright reviled. People look to one whose character is laid bare for all to see and compare them to the powerless, impoverished and downtrodden. When they do, they will find that, save for a few exceptions, these authority figures are lacking in some way compared to the common person. Since the power that they wield influences the lives of many, their character becomes especially pronounced to any who would seek to measure its quality. That does seem to be the perception of the majority, the Sorcerer King said. It is, Ludmilla agreed. In truth, however, those that they think are better will, in turn, have their true character revealed if granted enough power. The powerless, impoverished and downtrodden must behave to survive, so it often seems that they are far better than they actually are. His Majesty seemed to regard her with some surprise. This is an unexpectedly cynical view, he said. From how you speak of your domain and its people, I felt that you were the sort that saw potential in everyone. I do, Ludmilla smirked, but potential is simply what it is. It does not take a great deal of power to see how people change. Put a sword in a man's hand, whisper an intangible promise in his ear, and they can potentially go in any direction. Culture, law and other social constructs are the framework in which experiences that shape the character of each person occur. If this commissariat is to be established, then those with oversight must similarly have oversight and guidance that is even more austere. Even then, I still believe that purposely raising a commissary with my skills and abilities is too dangerous. You don't think it would help ensure that things stay on track? It surely would, if employed in good faith. However, Lady Shiltier. If I told you that the Executive Council of the Argland Confederation stood in direct defiance of His Majesty's will, what would you do? I would destroy their country, of course. Lady Shiltier's alignment shifted severely as she gave her incensed reply. The Sorcerer King stared at her. Shiltier. Yes, Lord Ines? Lady Shiltier's voice held an edge of anticipation. Before you fly off and destroy any country, check with me first. Oh. Her liege's smile transformed into a frown. She cast her crimson gaze down to the cracked pavement. I understand what you are trying to say, Lady Zaradnik, the Sorcerer King said, but do you think that this can happen so easily? Any group of people functions with a certain degree of trust, Ludmilla replied. This is not a strictly bad thing, but certain weaknesses are accepted alongside the strength it provides. The inner circle of your Majesty's vassals appears to have trust not only in their liege, but in one another. Those who earn the genuine trust of your closest vassals and your undead servitors are assumed to be performing their duties in good faith. A single bad actor may unravel incalculable amounts of economic and political investment. Executing the traitor after the fact will not fix the problem that they caused. Nothing is simple, it seems, His Majesty sighed. At least one of my ministers has voiced similar concerns. I will have to consult with the royal court over the proper implementation of this organization, if it is to be created at all. Now, I have one last question about this skill of yours. Yes, Your Majesty? What happens when you use it on me? Ludmilla blinked several times, then exchanged looks with Lady Shiltier. Her liege appeared similarly stupefied. Under His Majesty's expectant gaze, however, she eventually did as he asked. In hindsight, what she saw shouldn't have been a surprise. I see the reality that every ruler must face, she said. And what does that mean? You are out of alignment with yourself, Ludmilla answered. But that is to be expected. A sovereign is rarely allowed to wholly be themselves. Captain Iska returned to them a while later, and Ines requested that he direct them to a more promising location. As they made their way through the empty city streets, he mulled over the connotations of Baroness Zaradnik's justice radar. It was simple to see how Pandora's actor had come up with the embarrassing name for the skill. As a former human, Ines thought that the human-made laws of Reasties, which at their core were meant to preserve an orderly human society, seemed quite reasonable. More reasonable than the laws of his old world, at any rate. As such, it often appeared that the skill detected criminals, but the Baroness' assessment made it far from what it seemed to be. Alignment with my will, huh? Is that a good thing, or a bad thing? At least, by her words, she didn't run around believing that His Majesty the Sorcerer King was the personification of justice. Ines didn't know what he would do if something like that happened. In a way, it was nice, as she would probably never interpret what he said wrongly, provided that she was actively using the skill. She had even conveniently packaged her reading of him as the realities of kingship wherein a sovereign couldn't always do as he wished to and often had to do things that he might not want to. For the greater good of his subjects, of course. It was both wrong and right at the same time, and he couldn't figure out whether she had figured that out. As the Baroness was both accommodating and discreet, he doubted that he would ever know unless he worked up the courage to ask directly. He was both her god and her king, yet somehow her stance on his supposed godhood was something he wished that more people would assume. A powerful individual who was offered respect and acknowledgement for his deeds, but still a person just like everyone else. Ines continually tried to convince the NPCs that he, too, was capable of mistakes and did not know everything, but for some reason, it never stuck. If he said black was white they would all accept his statement as fact, yet if he claimed that he was wrong about something it couldn't possibly be. He was the greatest of the supreme beings, who were existences that stood above mere gods. They crossed several city blocks before arriving at a pretentious-looking building at the end of a walkway lined with dust-filled fountains. In the past, the cracked, dry grounds were probably carefully maintained gardens or some other green space. The building itself was composed of two wings that stretched to either side of the central structure. "What's this place?" he asked. "I don't know for sure," Captain Iska answered, "but it's filled with the remains of bookshelves and cabinets." There's a magical vault in the basement. I believe that's what your majesty asked for? Imperial, something, the Baroness said as she looked up at the writing over the entrance. The interior was just as Captain Iska had described, which was strange since that meant it was literally all bookshelves and cabinets. A layer of ash smothered the floor, leaving nothing but the charred remains of the building's furnishings. Even the metal parts had melted from the inferno, much like their findings from the first castle keep, or was it a mage tower? Have you managed to salvage anything from this city at all? Ines asked. It was already like this by the time I manifested, the captain answered. The elders didn't have anything, either. There's probably been plenty of time for others to pick this place clean. The merchants from Corpus weren't surprised at all, so it might have been them. Who knows how long anyone's had to take everything away. Even the lampposts were looted, the Baroness muttered. The lampposts? Yes, Your Majesty, she nodded. You can see fixtures for magical lighting all over this city, but they're empty. The only one that wasn't taken was the crystal in the High Emperor's staff, and that's probably because it was too hard to break off. The magical lighting of a city this large is probably worth tens of millions of gold coins. Using our prices, at any rate. Little things added up, he supposed. A city filled with magical conveniences accrued over generations was quite the treasure trove as long as one could find a market for everything. They descended to a basement similarly filled with burned-out remains. At the back of the west wing was the magical vault that Captain Iska had mentioned. A glance was all it took for Ines to recognize what was carved into its surface. A rune-crafted vault. Excitement welled up within him as he recalled the royal vault in Fiobirkana. Everything within had been perfectly preserved, and the vault itself would be a valuable reference for his rune-crafters in Kani village. A rune-crafted vault could stop the demon gods and an ancient dragon. Armor crafted with the same rune words must surely be better than anything that the local markets could offer. The problem now was how they would open it undamaged. In Fiobirkana, he had consumed a charge from a valuable artifact. They were not pressed for time here, however. He checked the time of day before raising a hand to his head, casting a message spell. Pandora's actor. Command me, Ines Summer. Ines tilted his head to one side, as if he could lean away from the doppelganger's ardor. We've come across a magical vault that you may be able to open. Are you currently in Nazarick? Yes, I'm in the treasury at the moment. I will open a gate to our location near the cottage on the surface in 5 minutes. I eagerly anticipate your summons, Ines Summer. He terminated the message, then looked over at the others. I've called for someone to come and open the vault, he said, but I will ask that everyone goes upstairs while he does so. Shiltir, Baroness Zaradnik and Captain Iska left without any questions. When the appointed time came, he cast the gate spell. Several moments passed in complete silence. Ines Summer. Ask. The gate spell was disrupted and his emotional suppression went into overdrive at the disembodied whisper behind him. He could have sworn he had just lost 10 years of his life, but that didn't matter to the undead. He turned to glare at Pandora's actor, who had foiled his own concealment. You, Ines Summer? A streak of crimson flashed down the stairs as Shiltir came flying down in response to his scream. Her glowing eyes settled on something behind him. Garnet Summer? She frowned. Ines Summer, I thought I just saw. Go back upstairs, Shiltir. I will call you when we are ready to proceed. Shiltir looked over her shoulder several times before disappearing up the stairs once more. Ines looked around himself, unable to locate the other person in the chamber. Pandora's actor? Yes, Ines Summer, Garnet's voice replied. In Yggdrasil, one could see concealed allies, allowing them to lead parties through dangerous areas while stealthily scouting ahead. As a pure arcane caster, knowing that there was a stealthed individual nearby that he couldn't detect put Ines on edge. Come to think of it, Nobril almost attacked Tora when she popped out of stealth at one time as well. Of the different class archetypes in Yggdrasil, rogues, rangers, bards, monks and certain races could all have substantial stealth ability. Once this ability surpassed the basic detection ability that most classes possessed, they effectively left no trace to those without access to advanced detection skills. The workings of this mechanic were one of the major weaknesses in the Sorceress Kingdom's domestic security. Deathseer's servitors only possessed basic detection ability, as did Soul Eaters and Elder Liches. Past level 15 or so, natives with the requisite classes could become undetectable to them when using their concealment skills. The problem became exponentially worse in environments with plenty of cover. Of Nazarek's forces, relatively few with high detection ability could be deployed. Most were a part of the base's defenses and were inactive due to the low-maintenance mode they were running. Mercenaries like Hanzos and eight-edged assassins they had small quantities of, but Hashabonapal was nearly out of resources to summon new ones. This left Aura as their best deployable detector, followed by Pandora's actor using the forms of rangers like Peroronchino and Tigris Euphrates. Solution was next in line, then Shizu. After Shizu came the Frost Dragons and the aerial transportation network. There were a handful of options that could be summoned with spells, but they were temporary and thus unsuited for maintaining security. He looked around again, wondering if this world had flaws in its concealment systems that he could exploit. There was no sound, smell nor any other sign of Pandora's actor turned Garnet, however, not even the slightest trace of his passage in the easily disturbed dust that covered everything. Is it really necessary to sneak around like that? Well, it was better safe than sorry. Having the Baroness spot him might lead to complications, as well. He forced some confidence into his voice as he spoke to the nothingness around him. This is the vault in question. Can it be opened without being damaged? In response, a slip of paper appeared out of thin air and fluttered to the ground. Pandora's actor was apparently standing right in front of him, and Ainz still didn't notice a thing. He leaned over to pick up the note, frowning down at the letters written upon it. Kane problem? A subtle change in the glowing runes over the vault's surface was the only indicator that Pandora's actor was tinkering with the magical devices that secured the door. Like many of the other rogues in Ainzul Gown, Garnet had originally been a combat-focused type and branched out into assassin paths. After Nazarek was conquered, however, he became responsible for all of the traps and various mechanisms in the guild base and had remade his build into a more classical thief-type rogue. This made him unparalleled at picking locks, disarming traps, and tinkering with devices and machines both magical and mundane. A minute later, the sound of mechanisms moving within the vault issued into the air. Is it unlocked? Ainz asked. Another slip of paper appeared. Ich habe die Aufgabe jetzt erfüllt. Ainz had no idea what it said. He crumpled up the note and put it away. Well, if everything's taken care of, it's time for you to head back. But I told you, Ainz said as the portal to his gate opened again, no German. He waited for several moments, looking around the chamber as the vault's mechanisms continued to work. Was he gone? He probably was. He left the gate open for a while longer just in case. Are you gone? I'm closing it now. After the portal closed, a dull rumble filled the chamber as the door of the vault shifted inwards and started to roll away. Ainz called for Shiltir and the others, and they made it back in time to see the triple doors slide out of sight. Baroness Zaradnik went ahead, her gaze scanning what lay beyond. It's empty. Unlike the royal vault of Theoburkana, the interior did not contain piles of treasure that glowed with the light of buried magic items. Confusion and a sense of disappointment settled over him. There were no piles of coins, nor were there any tapestries, statues or any other pieces of artwork. The only thing inside appeared to be the undead that had spawned over the long passage of time. Wait, there's something here. The Baroness knelt and stretched her hand towards a dust-covered object on the floor, then stopped. Do you see anything strange about this, Your Majesty? Ainz walked up behind her. He sensed the trace of an enchantment. A praise magic item. A book? It doesn't have a name. There's preservation magic on it, he said. There doesn't appear to be anything else, it's an unnamed item. Baroness Zaradnik peered at the book for several seconds before picking it up and dusting it off. Beyond her, something stirred. Look who! His warning came too late. Over 24 meters away, a cluster of round objects suddenly broke open, shaking off the dust that concealed them. A multitude of fleshy tentacles shot out towards the young noblewoman. Her eyes widened in surprise as they wrapped themselves around her arms and legs and body. The tentacles constricted around her and pulled, but her freedom effect caused them to phase through. The book in Baroness Zaradnik's hand fell to the ground. In its place appeared her softly glowing glaive. Ainz, Shiltir and Captain Iska watched as Baroness shot forward with blinding speed. Tentacles and viscera flew through the air as she dismantled the first of the 2-meter-tall organ eggs. Flesh and bone and body parts scattered everywhere when the rest of the undead in the vault haplessly fed themselves to the whirlwind of pure violence in their midst. The sound of the Baroness' boot heels echoed in the deathly silence that followed as she returned to pick up the book again. Her gaze went to the three of them. "Is something the matter?" No, Ines shifted his eyes away. "It's nothing." Baroness Zaradnik frowned slightly before returning her attention to the book. "Sheltier," Ines muttered, "whenever you have her over, make sure she never runs into that fellow." "He might look that way, Ines Summer," Sheltier leaned towards him and whispered back, "but he's actually quite a nice person." "Which would make it all the more tragic," he told her. Ines turned his attention back to the Baroness, who continued flipping through the pages of the book. "What does it say?" "I can't read most of it," she replied. "Dates, numbers, a few names, some words that have survived to the present day. From how it is structured, it might be a journal or a logbook. It has a very informal look, there are no seals or official-looking forms, so it may even be a diary." The Baroness continued flipping through until about halfway, where all that was left were blank pages. She kept going, and a frown marred her expression when she reached the last page. Looking back up, she turned the book around to show him. "Is it something she thinks I can read?" Sheltier leaned forward to look down at the book with him. To his surprise, her lips moved as her crimson gaze crossed over the letters written on the page. "Remember us."